everybody, it's Susan. Welcome to my channel, Susan Diamond Paint. February 16th devotional, Acts 7:59 through 60. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then he fell on his knees and cried out, "Lord, do not hold the sin against them." When he said this, he fell asleep. Chapter 16. One morning in April, Neil was alone in the law office. His uncle had been ill with rheumatoid fever for quite a long while, and he had been attending to the routine of business. The door opened, and a figure stood there, strange yet familiar. He had to think a moment before he realized that it was Orville Ogden, who used to come to Sweetwater so often, but who had not been seen there now for several years. He did look a day older. One eye was still direct and clear, and the other clouded and oblique. He still wore a stiff imperial and twisted mustache, the gray color of old beeswax, and his thin hair was brushed heroically up over the bald spot. "This is Judge Pomeroy's nephew, isn't it? I can't think of your name, my boy, but I remember you. Is the judge out?" "Please be seated, Mr. Ogden. My uncle's ill. He hasn't been in the office for several months. He's had a really very bad time of it. Is there anything I can do for you?" "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry." He spoke as if he were. "I guess all we fellows are getting older, whether we like it or not. It made a great difference when Daniel Forrester went." Mr. Ogden took off his overcoat and put his hat and gloves neatly on the desk, then seemed somewhat at a loss. "What is your uncle's trouble?" he asked suddenly. And Neil told him. "I was to have gone back to school this winter, but Uncle begged me to stay and look after the things for him. There was no one here he wanted to entrust his business to." I see, said Mr. Ogden thoughtfully. "Then you do attend to his business for the present?" He paused and reflected. "Yes, there was something that I wanted to take up with him. I am stopping off for a few hours only between trains. I might speak to you about it, and you can consult your uncle and write me in Chicago. It's a confidential matter and concerns another person." Neil assured him of his discretion, but Mr. Ogden seemed to find the subject difficult to approach. He looked very grave and slowly lit a cigar. "It is simply," he said at last, "a rather delicate suggestion I wish to make to your uncle about one of his clients. I have several friends in the government at Washington just at present, friends who would go out of their way to serve me. I have been thinking that we might manage it to get a special increase of pension for Mrs. Forrester. I am due in Chicago this week, and after my business there is finished, I'll be quite willing to go on to Washington to see what can be done, provided, of course, that no one, least of all your uncle's client, knows of my activity in the matter." Neil flushed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ogden," he brought out, "but Mrs. Forrester is no longer a client of my uncle's. After the captain's death, she saw fit to take her business away from him." Mr. Ogden's normal eye became as blank as the other. "What's that? He isn't her lawyer? Why, for 20 years—" "I know that, sir. She didn't treat him with much consideration. She transferred her business very abruptly." "To whom, may I ask?" "To a lawyer here in town, Ivy Peters." "Peters? I've never heard of him." "No, you wouldn't have. He wasn't one of the people who went to the Forrester house in the old days. He's one of the younger generation, a few years older than I. He rented part of the Forresters' land for several years before the captain's death, was their tenant. That's how Mrs. Forrester came to know him. She thinks he's a good businessman." Mr. Ogden frowned. "And is he?" "Some people think so." "Is he trustworthy?" "Far from it. He takes the cases nobody else will take. He may treat Mrs. Forrester honestly, but if he does, it will not be from principle." "This is very distressing news. Go on with your work, my boy. I must think this over." Mr. Ogden rose and walked about the room, his hands behind him. Neil turned to an unfinished letter on his desk in order to leave his visitor to be more free. Mr. Ogden's position, he understood, was a difficult one. He had been devoted to Mrs. Forrester, and before Constance had made up her mind to marry Frank Ellinger, before the mother and daughter began to angle for him, Mr. Ogden had come to the Forresters more frequently than any of their Denver friends. He hadn't been back, Neil believed, since that Christmas party when he and his family were there with Ellinger. Very soon afterward he must have seen what his womenfolk were up to, and whether he approved or disapproved, he must have decided that there was nothing for him to do but keep out. It hadn't been the Forresters' reveal of fortune that had kept him away. One could see that he was deeply troubled, and that he had her heavily on his mind. Neil had finished this letter and was beginning another when Mr. Ogden stopped beside his desk where he stood twisting his imperial tighter and tighter. You say this young lawyer is unprincipled? Sometimes rascals have a soft spot, a sentiment where women are concerned. Neil stared. He immediately thought of Ivy's dimples. A soft spot, a sentiment, Mr. Ogden. Why not go to his office? A glance would convince you. Oh, that's not necessary. I understand. He looked out of the window from which he could just see the treetops of the Forester Grove and murmured, Poor lady, so misguided. She ought to have advice from some of Daniel's friends. He took out his watch and consulted it, turning something over in his mind. His train was due in an hour, he said. Nothing can be done at present. In a few moments he left the office. Afterward, Neil felt sure that when Mr. Ogden stood there uncertainly, watch in hand, he was considering an interview with Mrs. Forster. He had wanted to go to her and had given it up. Was he afraid of his womenfolk? Or was it another kind of cowardice, the fear of losing a pleasant memory, or finding her changed, marred, a dread of something that would throw a disenchanting light upon the past? Neil had heard his uncle say that Mr. Ogden admired pretty women, though he had married a homely one, and that in his deep, non-committal way he was very gallant. Perhaps with a little encouragement he would have gone to see Mrs. Forster, and he might have helped her. The fact that he had done nothing to bring this about made Neil realize how much his own feeling toward the lady had changed. It was Mrs. Forster herself who had changed. Since her husband's death she seemed to have become another woman. For years Neil and his uncle, the Dalzells, and all her friends had thought of the captain as a drag upon his wife, a care that drained her and dimmed her and kept her from being all that she might be. But without him she was like a ship without a ballast, driven hither and thither by every wind. She was flighty and perverse. She seemed to have lost her faculty of discrimination, her power of easily and graciously keeping everyone in his proper place. Ivy Peters had been in Wyoming at the time of Captain Forster's illness and death, called away by a telegram which announced that oil had been discovered near his landholdings. He returned soon after the captain's funeral, however, and was seen about the Forster place more than ever. And there was nothing to be done on his fields in the winter, he amused himself by pulling down the old barn after office hours. One was likely to come upon him smoking his cigar on the front porch as if he owned the place. He often spent the evening there playing cards with Mrs. Forster or talking about his business projects. He had not made his fortune yet, but he was on the way to it. Occasionally he took a friend or two, some of the town boys, over to dine at Mrs. Forster's. The boys' mothers and sweethearts were greatly scandalized. Now she's after the Youngwoods, said Elliot's mother. She's getting childish. At last Neil had a plain talk with Mrs. Forster. He told her that people were gossiping about Ivy's being there so much. He had heard comments even on the street. But I can't bother about their talk. They've always talked about me and always will. Mr. Peters is my lawyer and my tenant. I have to see to him, and I'm certainly not going to go to his office. I can't sit in the house alone every evening and knit. If you came to see me any oftener than you do, that would make me talk. You're still young, younger than Ivy, and better looking. That never occurred to you? I wish you wouldn't talk to me like that, he said coldly. Mrs. Forster, why don't you go away to California, to people of your own kind? You know this town is no place for you. I mean to, just as soon as I can sell this place. It's all I have, and if I leave it to the tenants, it will run down, and I can't sell it to an advantage. That's why Ivy is here so much. He's trying to make the place presentable, pulling down the old barn that has become an eyesore, putting new boards in the porch floor where the old ones have rotted. Next summer I'm going to paint the house. Unless I keep the place up, I can never get a price for it. She talked nervously with exaggerated earnestness as if she was trying to persuade herself. And what are you asking for it now, Mrs. Forster? $20,000. You'll never get it, at least not until times have greatly changed. That's what your uncle said. He wouldn't attempt to sell it for more than 12. That's why I had to put it into other hands. Times have changed, but he doesn't realize it. Mr. Forster himself told me that it would be worth that. Ivy says he can get me $20,000, or if not, he'll take it off my hands as soon as his investments begin to bring in returns. And in the meantime, you're simply wasting your life here. Not altogether. She looked at him with a pleading plausibility. I'm getting rested after a long strain, and while I wait, I'm finding new friends among the young men, those your age and a little younger. I've wanted for a long while to do something for the boys in this town, but my hands were full. I hate to see them growing up like savages when all they need is a civilized house to come to and a woman to give them a few hints. They've never had a chance. You wouldn't be the boy you are if you'd never gone to Boston, and you always had older friends who'd seen better days. Suppose you'd grown up like Ed Elliott and Joe Simpson. I flatter myself I wouldn't be exactly like them if I had. However, it's no use discussing it. If you thought it over and made up your mind, I spoke of it because I thought you mightn't realize how it strikes the townspeople. I know, she tossed her head, her eyes glittered, but there was no mirth in them. It was more like a hysterical defiance. I know, they call me the Merry Widow. I rather like it. Neil left the house without further argument, and though that was 3 weeks ago, he had not been back since. Mrs. Forster had called to see his uncle in the meantime. The judge was as courtly as ever in his manner toward her, but he was deeply hurt by her defection, and his cherishing care for her would never be revived. He had attended to all Captain Forster's business for 20 years, and since the failure of the Denver bank had never deducted a penny for fees from the money entrusted to him. Mrs. Forster had treated him very badly. She had given him no warning. One day Ivy Peters had come into the office with a written order from her requesting that an accounting and all funds and securities be turned over to him. Since then she had never really spoken of the matter to the judge nor to Neil, save in that conversation about the sale of the property. Chapter 17. One morning when a warm May wind was whirling the dust up the street, Mrs. Forster came smiling into Judge Pomeroy's office wearing a new spring bonnet and a short black velvet cape fastened at the neck with a bunch of violets. Please be nice enough to notice my new clothes, Neil, she said coaxingly. They are the first I've had in years and years. He told her they were very pretty. And aren't you glad I have some at last? She smiled inquiringly through her veil. I feel as if you weren't going to be cross with me today and would do as what I asked you. It's nothing very troublesome. I want you to come to dinner Friday night. If you come, there will be 8 of us, counting Annie Peters. They are all boys you know, and if you don't like them, you ought to. Yes, you ought to. She nodded at him severely. Since you mind what people say, Neil, aren't you afraid they'll be saying you're a snob just because you've been to Boston and seen a little of the world? You mustn't be so stiff, so superior. It isn't becoming at your age. She drew her brows down into a level frown, so like his own that he laughed. He had almost forgotten her old talent for mimicry. What do you want from me? You used to always say it was no good asking people who didn't mix. You can mix well enough if you take the trouble, and this time you will for me, won't you? When she was gone, Neil was angry with himself for having been persuaded. On Friday evening he was the last guest to arrive. It was a warm night after a hot day. The windows were open, and the perfume of the lilacs came into the dusky parlor where the boys were sitting about in chairs that seemed too big for them. A lamp was burning in the dining room, and there Ivy Peters stood at the sideboard mixing cocktails. His sister Annie was in the kitchen helping the hostess. Mrs. Forster came in for a moment to greet Neil, then excused herself and hurried back to Annie Peters. Through the open door he saw that the silver dishes had reappeared on the dinner table, and the candlesticks and flowers. The young men who sat about in the twilight would not know the difference, he thought, if she had furnished her table that morning from the stock in Queensworth store. Their conception of a really fine dinner service was one hand-painted by a sister or sweetheart. Each boy sat with his legs crossed, one tan shoe swinging in the air and displaying a tan silk sock. They were talking about clothes. Joe Simpson, who had just inherited his father's clothing business, was eager to tell them what the summer styles would be. Ivy Peters came in shaking his drinks. You fellows are like a bunch of girls, always talking about what you're going to wear and how you're going to spend your money. Simpson wouldn't get rich very fast if y'all wore your clothes as long as I do. When did I get this suit, Joe? Oh, about the year I graduated from high school, I guess. They all laughed at Ivy. No matter what he did or said, they laughed in recognition of his general success. Mrs. Forster came back, fanning herself with a little sandalwood fan, and when she appeared the boys rose in alarm, one might have thought, from the suddenness of it. That much, at any rate, she had succeeded in teaching them. Are your cocktails ready, Ivy? You will have to wait for me a moment while I put some powder on my nose. If I'd known how hot it would be tonight, I'm afraid I would have had a roast for you. I'm browner than the ducks. You can pour them, though. I won't be long. She disappeared into her own room, and the boys sat down with the same surprising promptness. Ivy Peters carried the tray about, and they held their glasses before them, waiting for Mrs. Forster. When she came, she took Neil's arm and led him into the dining room. Did you notice, she whispered to him, how they hold their glasses? What is it they do to a little glass to make it so vulgar? Nobody could ever teach them to pick one up and drink out of it, not if there weren't tea in it. Aloud, she said, Neil, will you light the candles for me, and then take the head of the table? Please, you can carve ducks. Not so well as well as my uncle does, he murmured, carefully putting back a candle shade. Nor as Mr. Forster did. I don't ask that. Nobody can carve now as men used to, but you can get them apart, I suppose. The place at your right is for Auntie Peters. She is bringing in the dinner for me. Be seated, gentlemen, with a little mocking bow and a swinging of earrings. While Neil was carving the ducks, Annie slipped into the chair beside him, her naturally red face glowing from the heat of the stove. She was several years younger than her brother, whom she obeyed unquestioningly in everything. She had extremely bad complexion and a pale yellow hair with white lights in it, exactly the color of molasses taffy that had been pulled until it glistens. During the dinner she did not once speak except to say thank you or no thank you. Nobody but Mrs. Forster talked much until the first helping of duck was consumed. The boys had not yet learned to do two things at once. They paused only to ask their hostess if she would care for the jelly or to answer her questions. Neil studied Mrs. Forster between the candles, and she nodded encouragingly to one another, trying to draw them out, laughing at Roy Jones's heavy jokes or congratulating Joe Simpson upon his new dignity as a businessman with a business of his own. The long earrings swung beside the thin cheeks that were none the better, he thought, for the rouge she had put on them when she went to her room just before dinner. It was improved some women, but not her at least, not tonight when her eyes were hollow with fatigue, and she looked pinched and worn as he had never seen her. He sighed as he thought about how much work it meant to cook a dinner like this for 8 people, and a beefsteak with potatoes would have pleased them better. They didn't really like this kind of food at all. Why did she do it? How would she feel about it tonight when she sank dead weary into bed after these stupid boys had said good night and their yellow shoes had carried them down the hill? She was not eating anything. She was using all her vitality to electrify these heavy lads into speech. Neil felt that he must help her, at least try to. He addressed them one after another with energy and determination. He tried baseball, politics, scandal, and the corn crop. They answered him with monosyllables or explanations. He soon realized that they didn't want his polite remarks. They wanted more duck or to be left alone with it. Dinner was soon over, at any rate. The hostess' attempts to prolong it were unavailing. The salad and frozen pudding were dispatched as promptly as the roast had been. The guests went into the parlor and lit cigars. Mrs. Forster had the old-fashioned notion that men should be left alone after dinner. She did not join them for half an hour. Perhaps she had laid down upstairs, for she looked a little rested. The boys were talking now, discussing a camping trip Ed Elliott was going to take in the mountains. They were giving him advice about camp outfits, trout flies, mixtures to keep off the mosquitoes. I'll tell you, boys, said Mrs. Forster when she had listened to them for a moment. When I go back to California, I tend to have a summer cabin up in the Sierras, and I invite you one and all to visit me. You'll have to work for your keep, you understand, cut the firewood, bring in the water, wash the pots and pans, and go out and catch fish for breakfast. Ivy can bring his gun and shoot game for us, and I'll bake bread in an iron pot the old trapper's way, if I haven't forgotten how. Will you come? You bet we will. You know those mountains by heart, I expect, said Ed Elliott. She smiled and shook her head. It would take a lifetime to do that, Ed, more than a lifetime. The Sierras, there's no end to them, and they're magnificent. Neil turned to her. Have you ever told the boys how it was you first met Captain Forster in the mountains out there? If they haven't heard the story, I think they would like it. Really, you would? Well, once upon a time, when I was a very young girl, I was spending the summer at a camp in the mountains with my friends and my father's. She began there, but that was not the beginning of the story. Long ago, Neil had heard from his uncle that the beginning was a scandal and a murder. When Marian Ormsby was 19, she was engaged to Ned Montgomery, a gaudy young millionaire of the Gold Coast. A few weeks before the date set for their marriage, Montgomery was shot and killed in the lobby of a San Francisco hotel by the husband of another woman. The trial involved a great deal of publicity, and Marian was hurried away from curious eyes and sent up to the mountains until the affair should blow over. Tonight, Mrs. Forster began with Once Upon a Time sitting at one end of the big sofa, her slippers on a footstool and her head in shadow. She stirred the air before her face with a sandalwood fan as she talked, the rings glittering on her white fingers. She told them how Captain Forster, then a widower, had come into the camp to visit her father's partner. She had noticed him very little. She was off every day with a young man. One afternoon she had persuaded young Fred Harney, an intrepid mountain climber, to take her down the face of Eagle Cliff. They were almost down and were creeping over a projecting ledge when the rope broke and they dropped to the bottom. Harney fell in the rocks and was killed instantly. The girl was caught in a pine tree, which arrested her fall. Both her legs were broken, and she lay in the canyon all night in the bitter cold, swept by the icy canyon draught. Nobody at camp knew where to look for the two missing members of the party. They had stolen off alone for their foolhardy adventure. Nobody worried, because Harney knew all the trails and could not get lost. In the morning, however, when they were still missing, search parties went out. It was Captain Forrester's party that found Miriam and got her out by the lower trail. The trail was so steep and narrow that the turns round the jutting ledges so sharp that it was impossible to take her out on a litter. The men took turns carrying her, hugging the canyon walls with their shoulders as they crept along. With her broken legs hanging, she suffered terribly, fainted again and again. But she noticed that she suffered less when Captain Forster carried her, and that he took all the most dangerous places on the trail himself. I could feel his heart pump and his muscles strain, she said, when he balanced himself and me on the rocks. I knew that if we fell, we'd go together. He would never drop me. They got back to camp, and everything possible was done for her, but by the time a surgeon could be got up from San Francisco, her fractures had begun to knit and had to be broken over again. It was Captain Forrester I wanted to hold my hand when the surgeon had to do the things to me. You remember, Neil, he was always boasted that I never screamed when they were carrying me up the trail. He stayed at the camp until I could begin to walk, holding onto his arm. When he asked me to marry him, he didn't have to ask twice. Do you wonder? She looked with a smile about the circle and drew her fingertips absently across her forehead as if to brush away something, the past or the present, who could tell? The boys were genuinely moved while she was answering their questions. Neil thought about the first time he had ever heard her tell that story. Mr. Dalzell had stopped off with a party of friends from Chicago. Marshall Field and the president of the Union Pacific were among them, he remembered, and they were going through in Mr. Dalzell's private car to hunt in the Black Hills. She had, after all, not changed so much since then. Neil felt tonight that the right man could save her, even now. She was still her indomitable self, going through her old part, but only the stagehands were left to listen to her. All those who had shared in the fine undertakings and bright occasions were gone.